Imagine a ship far at sea in the Atlantic, and only one man aboard in touch with the outside world, the radio operator. At the turn of the 20th century, radio was called wireless, and the wireless operator's shipmates called him Sparks, because every tap of his code key sent sparks snapping through the night. Short sparks, long sparks, the dots and dashes of Morse code flying across the ocean. And now it's Christmas Eve, 1906. Over the seas come weather reports, sea conditions, and messages from home. For the Sparks, deciphering code is second nature. He has heard endless hours of dots and dashes. That's all he's ever heard, until that Christmas Eve, 1906, when that Sparks and many others, to their surprise, heard music. A Christmas Carol on Christmas Eve. The violin of Reginald Fessenden from his transmitting station in Massachusetts, for whomever cared to tune it in. Was this the first broadcast? Coded messages had been traveling along wires since the invention of the telegraph. But signals flying through the air without wires? Those thoughts resided only in the minds of a few scholars, tinkerers, and dreamers, who as early as the 1870s were stringing together coils of wire with batteries, switches, and other strange-looking devices, convinced that signals could be sent over long distances by electromagnetic waves. It was the young Italian, Guglielmo Marconi, just out of his teens, who tied together the ideas of others, and by 1894 was sending signals across his father's estate in Bologna. Within a year, his signals were traveling over 1.5 miles. By 1897, his wireless was sending messages to and from lighthouses and ships at sea. Then in 1901, Marconi picked out a spot on the English coast. And from there, in December, a wireless operator tapped out the letter S, and the faint signal was heard at a receiving station on the coast of Newfoundland. Marconi's dream was about coded messages, and that's all, just dots and dashes. And that's the dream the wireless carried across the Atlantic.
When people think about Guglielmo Marconi as the inventor of radio, they forget that broadcasting was not part of his scheme at all. Marconi was not thinking about having music boxes in people's homes that would emit, talk and music. This was not his vision. Marconi's vision was point-to-point communications.
While Marconi's vision had been realized, Reginald Fessenden's team was taking a different path, the road that would lead to that Christmas Eve broadcast.
Reginald Fessenden's vision for radio was based on a technical vision. What Marconi did was sent out what were called intermittent waves, dots and dashes from the Morse code. Fessenden's vision was to develop apparatus that sent out a continuous wave that could carry voice and music.
Now what was needed was a device that could receive these continuous waves. And the pieces of that puzzle were beginning to fit together in the mind of a poor American who came along with empty pockets, a love of music, and a dream of what today we call broadcasting. His name was Lee DeForest.
Roughly December 1906, January of 1907, he patents something called the Audion tube. And the Audion tube enables DeForest to pick up voice and music.
But by 1909, messages were still being sent letter by letter in Morse code. And on January 23rd, those within range heard the coded call of a ship in distress, CQD. The liner Republic had been rammed by an Italian ship, the Florida, and the Republic was going down off the New England coast. The wireless operator on board, 26-year-old Jack Binns, stayed at his code key hour after hour in his shattered wireless room as the ship took on water. His CQD calls brought nearby ships to the rescue of the Republic's passengers and crew and saved well over 1,000 lives. Americans were grateful. Of course, Jack Binns was a hero. And up and down the block in their neighborhoods, So were the schoolboys who had picked up Ben's distress calls and passed along the news. Then in 1910, Lee DeForest caused quite a stir when he transmitted the voice of opera star Enrico Caruso right from the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House in New York.
That was in January 1910, from the roof of the Metropolitan Opera House. The microphones were located in the footlights on the stage. I was up in the attic on the roof with a small antenna, and the broadcast spread for a distance of 35 miles.
The Met called the experiment a failure. DeForest's transmission faded in and out. But among those who heard it, or heard about it, a few more began to understand DeForest's dream, sending rich entertainment into music lovers' homes through the air. Then on April 14, 1912, it was the wireless that brought ships to the rescue of the survivors of the Titanic and sent back across the Atlantic the names of those on board rescue ships who would be coming home. America waited in desperation for the names to be picked out of the sky. Among those who decoded the messages when they finally came was an ambitious young wireless operator named David Sarnoff.
He's working as the manager for the Marconi radio station at the Wanamaker's department store in New York City. Monday morning, April 15th, he comes in to work and finds the airwaves filled with "The Titanic has sunk. Who are the survivors? Can anybody get these names down?" And he, with two assistants, spends the next 3 to 4 days trying to get down the names of the survivors that are on the Carpathia.
In the press, there was again great acclaim for Marconi and his wireless. And over time, the name of David Sarnoff, that young wireless operator, would echo across decades of broadcast pioneering. The role of the wireless in the Titanic disaster had focused the attention of Congress. Even as survivors were returning to New York, hearings into the wireless turmoil were underway. When the inquiry was over, so was the freewheeling open access to the airwaves of America. By the end of 1912, all transmitter operators were required to be tested and licensed. Again, a disaster at sea had focused the nation's attention on the wireless, and those who knew something about how it worked were all the rage. So the number of amateurs on the air continued to grow until April 1917, when America entered the First World War, and the government ordered that all amateur stations be silenced, their equipment dismantled. So what did they do, these young tinkerers? They went to war, by the thousands, the first wave of trained wireless operators to be followed by thousands more who were recruited and trained as the war went on. And when the boys returned from the war, they came home with their new skills and a willingness to spend endless hours listening to whatever came their way. They were the core of an audience for the kind of radio that was just around the corner. During the war, the Navy had acquired broad control over wireless communications in America, and when the war came to a close, it fought in the halls of Congress to monopolize the airwaves. Others in Washington were concerned that the nation's commercial wireless was dominated by a foreign interest, the British-owned Marconi Company. So in 1919, Washington turned to General Electric.
General Electric established the Radio Corporation of America, and within a month had transferred all of their radio rights to that new corporation. Additionally, GE had purchased the British interests in the American Marconi Company.
Among those who came along from Marconi to RCA was David Sarnoff, who brought along his dream of sending programs through the air by wireless.
He proposed what he called a radio music box, a box for the home, a market that had not been explored by the radio industry, where people could listen to concerts, to political speeches, to sporting events.
RCA became a giant. Soon American Telephone and Telegraph came aboard, and later Westinghouse Electric. This new enterprise had a strong grip on the communications industry in America. As early as 1909, Charles Herald had been transmitting weekly programs from San Jose, California. But it was in 1920 that radio broadcasting began to take hold. At the Detroit News, they dragged a phonograph up to a microphone at their new station, and people began dancing to the melodies of 8MK, the very beginnings of what became WWJ. In Pittsburgh, Dr. Frank Conrad was playing recorded music over his amateur station 8XK, and the folks at the Joseph Horn department store had an idea. They advertised Conrad's on-air concerts in the newspaper to stimulate sales of wireless receivers. Now, Frank Conrad was the assistant chief engineer at Westinghouse Electric, and the department store ad did not go unnoticed at Westinghouse. The plan was to sell their brand new receivers by giving listeners something to listen for. Information and entertainment transmitted at advertised regular times. Broadcasting as we know it today. 8XK became commercial station KDKA, the first in the nation. They launched their programming with coverage of returns in the Harding-Cox election on November 2, 1920. It sounded like this.
This is KDKA of the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company in East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We shall now broadcast the election returns. We'd appreciate it if anyone hearing this broadcast would communicate with us. We are very anxious to know how far the broadcast is reaching and how it is being received.
KDKA stuck to it, and other stations sprung up in city after city. By the end of 1921, 29 stations were on the air, and no sooner had they wired together their transmitters than they were putting their microphones in front of anything they hoped would make a noise. That same year, stations were broadcasting from where the important events of the day were taking place. David Sarnoff set up a special transmitter to broadcast the Dempsey-Carpentier heavyweight fight. KDKA took a microphone to Forbes Field and aired a Pirates game in the dog days of summer. And by fall, WJZ was at the Polo Grounds when the Yankees beat the Giants 3-0 in the opening game of the World Series. Radio was taking Americans places they would never otherwise go. They heard the music of the Vincent Lopez Orchestra direct from the Pennsylvania Hotel in New York over WJZ. KSTP aired dance tunes from the Marigold Ballroom in Minneapolis. And for the listening and dancing pleasure of Kansas City folks, WDAF aired the Coon Sanders Nighthawks from the Mulebach Hotel. By the time 1922 came to a close, Americans were picking up through their headsets almost 700 stations, where folks were trying this and that, figuring out how to do this new thing called radio. They learned to drape studio walls to reduce reverberation. They fitted microphones with lampshades, thinking the entertainers might feel more at ease speaking into what appeared to be a lamp. Performers often wore tuxedos after 6 in the evening because, after all, they were guests in listeners' homes at the dinner hour. And listeners found it was not easy to tune in the programs.
If it was a crystal set, you had something called a cat whisker, which was a very fine piece of wire, and you moved the cat whisker around on the piece of crystal until you found the point at which you were getting some kind of reception. This was a rather arduous task. If you had an early set with tuning knobs, it wouldn't be one tuning knob, it would be 5 tuning knobs, and so you had to tune all 5 of them until you found the station, and you could leave those knobs in exactly the same place, and the next night the station would not be there.
But when the elusive signals could be captured, they would be especially welcome in the homes of rural Americans who lived where the nearest neighbor might be miles away.
It's difficult for those of us who grew up accepting radio as an everyday part of life to really appreciate what it must have meant for a rural Nebraska farm family to indeed receive their first radio, so that each night they could tune in far-flung stations. They could tie in with the rest of the world.
The great white father now calls you his brother.
The sound of a human voice from some faraway place that brought comfort to the isolated delivered a challenge to the most enthusiastic listeners.
The most important thing in early radio in the 20s was to be able to hear far away. People thought that was great. It was very exciting to be able to hear a program from someplace you'd never been to and might never be able to go. And if you could only catch a radio station for 3 or 4 minutes, you didn't want it to be taken up by some silly song. You wanted to be able to know where it was.
While listeners were struggling to pull in those tinny voices from far away, station operators were straining to fill the hours of their broadcast day, rounding up anyone in town who was willing to sing or play a tune in front of a microphone or build the bodies of those at home, or most anyone who thought they had something to say, as long as they would do it for free. But folks from around the neighborhood were not going to drop by radio stations and perform for nothing forever. Before long, many of those early broadcasters who had eagerly strung their antenna wires across the sky began to wonder how radio could make some money to pay the bills.
So there was a contest held by a magazine called Radio Broadcast. How should broadcasting be supported? There were a variety of hearings around the country and proposals for all kinds of different methods of support. Philanthropy, licensing fees like they have in Britain, make radio a public utility and fund it that way.
One thing seems certain. Radio would never be supported by advertising.
Advertising-supported broadcasting was actually very controversial. Why was it controversial? Because people regarded their homes as their castles, as their kind of private preserves away from billboards and other kinds of public entertainments and advertising. So here was a device that had the potential to bring sales pitches right into your home, loud, blaring sales pitches.
But of course, advertisements did begin to be heard on radio. And those earliest advertisers were careful not to offend the ears of their audience.
Radio was new. You didn't want anyone turning it off. They just barely turned it on. They said, we're not going to do any direct advertising. We'll do what we're going to call indirect advertising. We're going to name the programs after the sponsors. We're going to name the performers after the sponsors. My favorite example is the Happiness Boys, a duet who sang for Happiness Candy Company.
We two boys without a care entertain you folks out there. That's our happiness.
The Happiness Boys were Billy Jones and Ernie Hare. The team was also heard as the Interwoven Pair for Interwoven Socks.
I'm Billy Jones. I'm Ernie Hare. We're the Interwoven Pair.
And they were the Tasty Loafers for Tasty Bread.
Representing Tasty Bread, how do you do?
There were the Flit Soldiers for Flit Fly Spray, the Ipana Troubadours for Ipana Toothpaste, the Clico Club Eskimos for Clico Club Ginger Ale, the Wonder Bakers, and the A&P Gypsies. Advertisers had their foot in the door, and not everyone was happy. Radio was becoming a hot topic. Everyone had something to say about the new medium. Comments and criticism came from many quarters as the nation came to see that broadcasters had a tool which would play a role in shaping the nation's culture. It was in those early days that conflicts first arose over what words, whose thoughts, and which ideas would come out of the radios in America's homes. And because it was often the privileged who made their voices heard, broadcasters generally invited into their studios only those performers who would not offend the most dignified listeners.
Radio station owners were very concerned about their perception in the community, about reaction to their programming, and very concerned that they not alienate their audiences. So many of them thought that they had to only broadcast very proper, kind of upright music and talk. And so they would broadcast what the radio historian Eric Barnow famously called potted palm music. And this music would be a contralto or a soprano singing, light operatic music, maybe music from Gilbert and Sullivan, and that was it. It was feared that music like jazz, which was enormously controversial in the 1920s, particularly black jazz, it was feared that if you broadcast that, your listeners would be outraged and would shut the station off. There were many black bands who couldn't get on the radio only because they were black. What's surprising is that they got on at all, and some of them did, and one of the ways that they got on were through remote broadcasts. For example, Louis Armstrong and Fletcher Henderson could be heard from remotes from Roseland, or Fats Waller could be heard out of Chicago on remotes. Duke Ellington could be heard on remotes. So what's surprising is not that African American musicians were banned from radio, but that they got on, and some of them did get on, to the great pleasure of not only black listeners, but white listeners too.
And so broadcasters were learning that stations flourished when they aired what listeners wanted to hear. By the mid-20s, this original American music was in the air everywhere. Over the radio, jazz became the soundtrack of the Roaring '20s. Sooner or later, someone was going to think of acting out plays on the radio. And they did. In 1922 at WGY, General Electric's new station in Schenectady, New York, when a group of actors began regular Friday night broadcasts of the plays of the day. The WGY players were a hit, and other stations were soon airing their own dramatic programs. 1924 became known as the year of the Radio Christmas. Companies all around the country, hundreds of them, were turning out radios, and they were selling like hotcakes. Everybody wanted to be in on the radio boom. By that New Year's Eve, 10 million Americans were tuned into radio. As the technology was improving, radios were being built into handsome cabinets that Mother would permit among her finest furniture. And one of the voices that came from the stylish new receivers set a new style of broadcasting. Graham McNamee from a ballpark press box.
It wasn't just that the hardware of radio had to be invented. The software of radio had to be invented too. How are you going to talk over the radio? There were people who gave talks over the radio. They were often given in a pretty flat, declarative form. Well, once you have sports on the radio, you can't bring people into the game if you're going to talk like that. And what Graham McNamee did, who was probably the first, and by many people's accounts, the greatest sportscaster ever on radio, Graham McNamee invented the play-by-play and the blow-by-blow.
And so Graham McNamee, who actually knew very little about baseball, didn't particularly like the game, became, ironically enough, the first great radio voice. He did the World Series in 1923 along with a fellow by the name of Grantland Rice, Granny, the grand cursor of the press box, one of the eminent sports writers of his time. Actually, Grantland Rice was to do play-by-play, but he was so out of his element, and rightly understood that at some point he simply said off air, "I can't do this. I'm not going to try," and he gave the baton, the microphone, to a Graham McNamee. McNamee took it and became the very embodiment of the World Series for the next decade, broadcasting the series through 1934-35.
And in doing so, he brought enormous amount of repertorial detail to radio announcing. He brought a great deal of immediacy and emotion to radio broadcasting, and a great deal of intimacy.
How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Graham McNamee speaking from Navin Field in Detroit, Michigan. We're here this afternoon to witness the opening of the great annual baseball classic, the World Series, played this year between the Detroit Tigers and the Chicago Cubs.
And that style of conveying exactly what you're seeing at that moment to a listener who can't see what you're seeing and whom you can't see, affected radio news reporting in particular, and affected a whole host of other kinds of announcing.
He simply didn't do baseball. He did political conventions, he did election nights, he did boxing, he did football games. But because baseball was without question the major sport and the World Series was its Everest event, he became embodied and identified with the World Series. How popular was he? 1925. And this could never have happened even as earlier as a year or two before, simply because the reach of radio was not that ubiquitous. Graham McNamee, at the end of the World Series, a 7-game affair, comes back to the offices in New York. He finds 50,000 pieces of correspondence, mostly, in effect, letters written to him. He was like something manna from heaven. He was almost a divine.
More and more now, broadcasters were connecting stations together by phone wires so programs could be heard simultaneously in 2 or more cities. These hookups were usually patched together for coverage of special events. In 1924, AT&T wired together 12 stations for a broadcast of the Republican Party's convention. AT&T was starting to see a bright future in broadcasting. So did the other shareholders in RCA, General Electric and Westinghouse. After much squabbling about how to carve up the broadcasting pie, the 3 corporations created a new company whose sole business would be broadcasting. On September 9, 1926, they announced the formation of the National Broadcasting Company. NBC went on the air in spectacular fashion, with a 4-hour broadcast from the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York on the night of November 15, 1926. The program dialed in distant places so listeners could dance to the big bands of Ben Burney and Vincent Lopez. Will Rogers was heard from Kansas City. A reported 5 million Americans stayed at home in their own living rooms, tuned in to a big night of big bands and big stars. And they heard it all for free. That caught the ear of those who watched over the future of the entertainment industry. Soon NBC was operating 2 networks, the Red Network and the Blue, sending into listeners' homes programs sponsored by the familiar brand names they were used to seeing in magazines. While NBC was getting started, in Philadelphia, a young man working at his father's cigar company tried radio advertising to market their La Paulina cigars. His father thought that the company money had been squandered on the new fad, radio, until more and more Philadelphia gentlemen started lighting up their La Paulinas. The young man who had seen the potential of radio convinced his father to invest in a struggling network called the Columbia Broadcasting System. And in September 1928, William S. Paley became president of CBS. He was 27 years old. Radio programs were still mostly musical recitals of one kind or another, but some stations were airing original dramatic programs created just for radio. As early as 1926, Chicago listeners had been listening to 2 white men doing black dialect as characters called Sam and Henry. In 1929, the team, Freeman Gosden and Charles Correll, moved to NBC, and they brought along with them the characters they had renamed along the way, Amos and Andy.
When Amos and Andy was on, which was from 7 to 7:15 every night, taxis went unhailed, movie theaters had to pipe the show into the movie houses so people wouldn't leave. This was a show that people who were alive then will tell you they could hear if they were walking down the street at night of a summer's evening and all the windows were open and you just walked from block to block. You could listen to the entire show of Amos and Andy because everybody was listening to it.
Oh, let me see here now. Is you the lessee or the lessor? Oh, I know what you is. You the lessee.
How you figure?
Well, I pull the contract out of my pocket. You say lessee, so that make you the lessee, don't it?
For many Americans who heard NBC's first broadcast of Amos and Andy, those were heady times. America was on the move. There were more than 20 million cars on the roads, and as many telephones in the homes. The Ford Motor Company had raised workers' wages from $6 to $7 a day. That year, Americans would spend almost $500 million on radios. And Wall Street was the road to riches. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry was buying stocks on margin, with money they didn't have. That first network broadcast of Amos and Andy was on August 19, 1929. 66 days later, the bottom fell out. The stock market came tumbling down, signaling the beginning of a depression that would last for more than a decade, destroying rich men's fortunes and poor men's dreams. America had not seen it coming. The 20s had been so hot, so high, and now, out from underneath, came the 30s. 4 million unemployed in 1930, 8 million in 1931. The average worker is now making $17 a week, and lucky to have it. By 1932, 34 million are surviving on no income at all. A generation of Americans loses confidence in itself. And this is when radio comes of age in America. The network's programs found their way into homes where families gathered around the radio to hear a nation trying to sing and talk its way out of its despair.
You know, it's become commonplace to say that radio united America. Well, radio did unite America, and it did so for a particular reason. Network radio really comes into its own during the Great Depression. People are afraid, they're out of work, and there is enormous class strife. In 1934 alone, when